The sky was a bit overcast, but there was no rain. The air in the town of Riverview still carried that familiar scent of damp grass, quintessential southern spring, and somewhere in the distance, the jingle of a food truck drifted like a sparse background score to a small town half awake, half dreaming. Miles Thatcher sat in an old pickup truck, engine still running, eyes fixed on a faded sign in front of him. Dawnline Café, start your day right. The slogan, which he had come up with 12 years ago, now looked like a broken promise written in cheap paint. The sign was tilted, the lamp above it flickering, like it was clinging to a shred of dignity for a breakfast joint that had once been his pride. Miles turned off the engine, took a deep breath. His hair was no longer styled with gel like it used to be. It was hidden beneath an old trucker-style baseball cap. He wore faded jeans with worn knees, a denim jacket, and rubber-soled boots that had lost their color. His 3-day stubble added the final touch to his disguise, completely masking the polished CEO who once stepped confidently into press conferences and shareholder meetings. Today, he wasn't the founder of Dawnline's 14-branch empire. Today, he was just a tired truck driver in need of a decent cup of coffee. The glass door opened with a small jingle. No one looked up. One customer hissed through his teeth, impatient from waiting too long. Miles stepped inside. No one greeted him. No one smiled. There was only the clink of spoons and mugs, the hiss of the coffee machine, and the breeze sneaking in through a back door that wouldn't shut properly. The smell of food filled the air, fried grease, eggs, waffles, but it no longer carried that sense of warmth he'd once envisioned while designing the brand's concept. Now, it just smelled like work. At a glance, the place looked clean. The floor was mopped. The counter had no visible stains. But the atmosphere was off. Not because of the temperature, but because of the absence of something he used to call the soul of the brand. Smiles, eye contact, a sense of welcome. Miles chose the table by the window, next to a ceiling fan that clanked rhythmically. He sat down on a worn-out orange booth seat and felt how the backrest sagged, a dent shaped by many weary bodies before him. A young woman approached his table, holding an empty steel tray and an order pad in her left hand. Her beige uniform didn't quite fit, wrinkled collar, top button undone. Her hair was tied back, but a few strands clung to her forehead from sweat. On her chest was a plastic name tag, Haley. She stopped beside the table, offered a faint smile, and spoke in a soft southern accent. "Hi there. Want some coffee?" There was no spirit in her voice. The smile didn't reach her eyes, and those eyes, shadowed by light circles, belonged to someone who hadn't slept properly in nights. Miles nodded. "Thanks. Black. No sugar." Haley nodded quickly, turned around almost instantly. No follow-up questions, no pause, no second glance. He sat there in silence and began observing. At the next table, a group of 4 whispered complaints about how long it was taking to get their food. A young mother distracted her child with a phone, her eyes nervously darting to the clock. 2 construction workers poked at their plates of cold eggs, occasionally looking toward the kitchen. At the register, a male staff member was entering orders without greeting customers, eyes constantly flicking to a hidden phone beneath the counter. Everyone was doing their jobs, but no one was truly present. Miles looked around. On the wall where each Dawnline location used to showcase its warmth, there was a crooked Employee of the Month board. The wooden frame was scratched. The latest photo had a corner torn off. Only Lay remained of the name. Probably Haley, but no one had fixed it. The old tape still dangled from the edge. The previous photo was crooked, like someone had hastily put it back up. It felt like someone had tried to take it down, but no one cared enough to finish the job. To Miles, that detail hit like a punch to the chest, because Dawnline was never just about eggs and coffee. It used to be a place that honored people, a second home for small dreams. And now it was a place where even the honored were half forgotten. Haley returned. In her hand was a plain white mug of black coffee with a chip on the rim. She placed it on the table gently, so softly it didn't make a sound. Miles noticed her hands. There were red rashes around her wrist, likely from long exposure to dish soap or cleaning chemicals. She spoke quietly. "You want to order something now?" He nodded. Ham and egg sandwich, soft yolk, side of fries, please. Haley nodded again, didn't write anything down. She knew the menu by heart, a skill honed by morning shifts over many months, but her shoulders slumped as she walked away. Miles picked up the mug and took a sip. The coffee was weak, not terrible, but not memorable. Not because the recipe was off, but because whoever made it didn't have the heart left to care. He wondered, was this still the place I built? Or just a cheap copy of a beautiful idea? At the next table, two college students sighed. An old man shook his head, got up, and left without ordering. Miles jotted that down in a small notebook tucked inside his jacket. Haley returned to grab another cup, her movements precise, efficient, nothing wasted, but soulless. And he knew. He knew something was wrong, not with the equipment, not with the menu, but somewhere deeper, something no operations report could ever show. Right then, in that little roadside cafe in a barely known town, Miles Thatcher, the founder of Dawnline, understood that what he was facing wasn't a logistical issue. It was a fracture in belief, and Haley, with her smile that never reached her eyes, was the first mirror reflecting that truth. The doorbell chimed again as a new customer walked in, but no one looked up. Haley had just placed a cup of coffee down at table 3, the other hand holding a menu, trying to force a smile back onto a face that clearly showed fatigue. Miles remained seated by the window, eyes following her, not like a customer, but like someone trying to piece back together a mirror he himself once built. And then he heard it for the first time, a sharp, loud, impatient voice coming from the kitchen. "Haley, how many times do I have to tell you? If you're this slow, stop taking morning shifts." The voice didn't need a face to go with it, but Miles leaned slightly past the edge of his table to glance toward the kitchen counter. Through the partially closed stainless steel door, he could just make out a medium-built man with slick-back hair, his face red like he'd just stepped out of an oven. His apron was stained with grease, and his gloved hands rested on his hips. He didn't seem to care that customers were seated just a few feet away. The way he called Haley's name, it was like scolding a malfunctioning machine. Haley didn't respond immediately. She continued placing the menu in front of the new customer, her voice barely audible. "Hi there. What would you like to order today?" A robotic greeting, but underneath it was a thin, trembling undertone, as fragile as morning dew on a cold window pane. Miles caught it. Not everyone would, but someone who had led over 400 employees in the service industry, he would. She turned and walked toward the bar area, where the dish bin and order printer sat. Every step was measured, nothing excessive, but also nothing alive. It was like she was performing a role in a film she didn't audition for, directed by someone who never listened. "She's not slow," Miles muttered under his breath, just loud enough for himself to hear. And then everything seemed like it would go on the same until it didn't. Miles was halfway through his sandwich when another sound came from the kitchen. Not a shout this time, but something different. Thin, broken, like someone trying to hold it in, but failing. A sob, a choke sound, crying. Miles froze, his fork suspended midair. He looked toward the kitchen door. No one else in the cafe noticed. Customers kept flipping their menus. The cashier stayed glued to the POS screen, but he knew exactly what he had just heard. Haley's voice slipped through the crack in the door. I just need 2 minutes. I've been standing 6 hours straight. I'm just asking 2 minutes to get some water." A pause, then Brent's voice, no longer loud but still cold, sharp and unrelenting. "If you're that weak, maybe this job isn't for you." In that moment, the air in the cafe felt frozen. Not because anyone had stopped moving, but because something inside Miles had cracked. A moral boundary he once thought untouchable was now being trampled right in the middle of the brand he had built. He set his fork down, gently but with intent. His right hand gripped the table's edge. He stood up, calmly walked down the aisle between tables, past customers who remained unaware, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the kitchen door. Every step Miles took now wasn't just observation, it was decision. He was no longer a CEO doing a field check. He was a man standing up. His hand touched the cold stainless steel of the kitchen door, the kind with automatic spring hinges. He pushed it open slightly, and in that instant, the world behind it revealed itself like a backstage scene never meant to be seen. Haley was standing by the sink, shoulders hunched, her sleeve wiping away a tear. Her eyes were red, but she quickly turned as if afraid to be caught looking vulnerable. Brent had his back turned, barking orders to the line cook. Eggs for table 4, soft yolk, no burnt edges. How many times do I have to say it? The two young cooks, one with his long hair tied back, Emery, and the shorter one, Tino, were pretending to be busy, but their eyes avoided the center of the storm. Haley was no longer crying, but her face looked like it had just been slapped with something Miles knew all too well. Silent humiliation. A kind of wound that doesn't need anyone to scream. Just being seen collapsing is enough pain. Miles didn't enter right away. He stood at the door, eyes scanning the kitchen, the fryer puffing smoke, trash can overflowing with empty egg cartons, grease-slicked walkways. But what caught in his throat wasn't the burnt smell. It was Haley's expression when she saw him standing there. She wasn't scared. She wasn't embarrassed. She was surprised that someone had witnessed. And then he spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to bring everything to a halt. I think she just asked for 2 minutes. Brent turned around, irritation etched on his face. Who the hell are you? Miles didn't answer. He looked straight at Haley, his voice softening. You needed some water, right? Haley nodded gently, still unsure who this man was. All she knew, for the first time that day, someone didn't treat her like a piece of service software. Miles pressed his lips together. He knew the twist hadn't come yet. He hadn't revealed anything. But the battle had begun in that exact second. Inside the kitchen, time didn't stop, but everything seemed to freeze for a few seconds after Miles spoke. His words, I think she just asked for 2 minutes, hung in the air like a blade, slicing through the invisible mask everyone in the cafe had worn all morning. No one responded right away. No one looked at each other. The chill in the room didn't come from the AC. It came from that awkward, sinking feeling when a stranger steps into a space where everyone had been pretending nothing was wrong. Haley remained frozen. Her uniform was wrinkled, sleeves pushed up from quickly wiping her tears, trying not to get caught. But now someone had seen. And strangely, she didn't feel ashamed. Her eyes, red and tired, stared directly at Miles, lit with disbelief. Disbelief that someone had spoken up. Disbelief that a customer had heard and intervened. Brent placed both hands on his hips and walked toward Miles. The man was broad, his footsteps hitting the tile with a dull thud. His voice was low and gruff, dripping with the authority of someone used to barking orders. I don't know who you are, but we're short-staffed and everyone's busy. We can't stop everything because someone's having a weak moment. Miles stood his ground. His gaze didn't flinch. His face stayed calm, but inside was a storm. She needs a break. Just 5 minutes. The statement wasn't a request, and it wasn't a plea. It was a declaration so reasonable that anyone who challenged it would instantly expose themselves. Haley hadn't moved, as if she couldn't believe the miracle was still unfolding. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Then another voice spoke, soft, small, but clear. It came from the corner of the kitchen. She hasn't had a single sip of water since this morning. Everyone turned. It was Emery, the young cook with curly brown hair, loosely tied at the back, slim build, shoulders slightly hunched from hours on the line. Emery didn't look Brent in the eye. He stared at the stove, still stirring sauce with a wooden spoon, but his voice was steady, not confrontational, but not trembling either. Brent turned to him, brow furrowed. Emery, just mind your station. Miles looked at Emery, then at Brent, then at Haley. Her eyes seemed to say, don't get involved because of me. But it was too late. Miles was not the kind of man who looked away when someone else was breaking. I'm here, Miles said slowly, his voice as even as a heart monitor. And I'm watching. Brent exhaled sharply, clearly irritated. We can't just stop mid-shift so someone can take a break. There's a protocol. Miles gave a slight nod, not challenging, but firm. I'm not talking about protocol. I'm talking about people, about how you just spoke to her in front of this entire kitchen. Silence. The words weren't loud, weren't aggressive, But somehow, they made everyone stop what they were doing. Tino, the second-line cook, was pretending to wash lettuce but clearly listening. Haley hadn't moved. She stood there, a witness, a target, and now, someone who had just heard something she had never heard from any manager. "I'm here, and I'm watching." Miles turned to Haley. "You need to sit for a bit, right now. I'll stand here just for a few minutes. They won't fall apart without you." Brent opened his mouth, but Miles raised a hand. Not high, but just enough to be firm. "I don't hold any authority here, but I know how to observe, and I will remember every word, every reaction, especially when someone's only asking for a glass of water." Haley pressed her lips together. She glanced at Emery. Just for a second. It was a look filled with gratitude. He gave a barely visible nod, a signal. "Go. This time you're not alone." And so she stepped away from her station, backing toward the kitchen exit. Step by step, like someone emerging from an invisible cage no one had dared to touch for the past 6 hours. When the stainless steel door swung shut behind her, it made a soft swishing sound, like the exhale of a breath no one had dared to release. Miles turned to Brent. Not a word more. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist. He simply looked. And from that look, Brent knew. There was something very unusual about this man. Miles returned to his table in silence. No one in the cafe seemed to notice he had just stepped out of the kitchen. No one asked. No one showed curiosity, as if this place had grown too used to people staying silent about things that shouldn't happen. He pulled out his chair, sat down and stared at the now cold sandwich on his plate, but didn't touch it again. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind meant for strategic meetings, now sitting awkwardly on a diner table stained with rings of old coffee. A black ballpoint pen, not for jotting down orders, but to begin documenting the truth. On the first page, he wrote the title, Riverview, Branch Number 7, Morning 9 to 11:15. Beneath it, the first line, "The air in the cafe is cold, not from temperature, but from people." He kept writing, "High tension. No one smiles naturally. Both staff and customers are in endurance mode. Manager's public scolding. Caused discomfort, but no one reacted, suggesting this happens often. Customers walking out. Elderly man at table 4 left without ordering. Pair at table 6 still haven't been approached after 15 minutes. Haley, shouldering the entire floor, running orders, clearing trays, answering customers. No support. Emery, the quiet gatekeeper. Not the one in charge, but willing to speak up when no one else dares. Quiet leadership potential." Miles paused. He recalled that moment in the kitchen, Haley's eyes when, for the first time, someone had stopped to listen, instead of brushing past like everyone else. She didn't need him to be a CEO. She just needed someone who wouldn't look away. A sharp shout made him turn his head. At table 2, a young mother was flustered. Her son, maybe 3 years old, had accidentally knocked over a glass of orange juice. The yellow liquid spread across the table, dripping to the floor. She quickly grabbed napkins, trying to mop it up, her eyes full of apology as she pulled her son back into his seat, whispering, "I'm sorry," under her breath. She was clearly stressed, maybe because she knew she had just interrupted the system. No one in the cafe came to help, until Haley, across the room in the middle of serving waffles to another table, noticed. She gently set down her tray, apologized to the guests, then turned to retrieve a clean cloth. It took her 10 seconds. She walked over to the little boy, knelt down, wiped up the orange juice, and smiled as she said, "It's okay. We all have bad days sometimes." Her voice was so soft, the boy stopped crying. He sniffled, looked at her, then gripped his mother's hand a little tighter. Miles wrote another line. "Haley has the ability to de-escalate tense situations. You can't teach that in training manuals. Only those who've been deeply hurt know how to offer that kind of gentleness." An older man nearby, clearly a regular, turned to Miles. He wore a flannel shirt, a baseball cap with the Braves logo. He didn't speak loudly, but loud enough for Miles to hear. "That girl used to be the top student around here. Best in her class. Got a scholarship. But then her mom passed suddenly. No one left to care for her little brother, so she had to drop out. Miles looked at the man. His eyes weren't filled with pity, but with something else, regret. As if the whole town knew Haley's story, but no one knew how to help her move forward. The man added, "She never complains, but no one ever asks if she's okay either." The words cut deep, simple, but sharp. Miles turned to a new page. Haley, personal history erased by workload. Former honor student. Lost mother, dropped out to care for younger brother. Stays silent, overworks, never requests time off. Not acknowledged, even on the Employee of the Month board. He paused again, looked over to the counter. Haley was back at work. No complaining, no slowness, no sign she had just wiped away tears, or orange juice. Miles gripped the notebook. The pages were starting to crumple from the coffee stains, but it didn't matter. This was the real data, not the polished numbers on corporate spreadsheets. These were the stories no one reported. But they were killing the soul of the brand he had once been proud of, and he knew. This investigation didn't begin with a CEO title. It began with sitting down and listening to the things no one dared to say. 11:58 a.m. The cafe was brushing up against the start of its lunch rush. Pans clattered in the back. The order printer whined nonstop. The sounds of forks, chairs scraping, kids crying, coffee being poured, all wove together into a chaotic symphony of the service industry. But for Miles, the loudest sound was tension. Ever since the incident in the kitchen, he had been watching more closely. Every small detail. The way Haley moved faster, but more quietly, like she was trying not to be noticed. The way Emery silently adjusted the fryer temperature without being told. And most of all, Brent's eyes, no longer shouting, but colder than ever. At table 3, an elderly man, probably over 70, wearing an old khaki jacket and a baseball cap, called Haley over. His voice, a mix of frustration and complaint, rang louder than the background music. "Hey girl, you trying to serve me this rubber egg? If that's a soft yolk, then even a dog would turn it down." Haley froze. She had been carrying drinks to another table and had to pivot instantly. She walked over, bowed her head slightly, and spoke in a voice as soft as a draft through a cracked window. "I'm sorry, sir. Let me take it back and have them remake it for you." That might have been the end of it. A bad plate of eggs, a quiet apology, an elderly customer, a young waitress taking the hit. But it wasn't. Brent stormed out from the kitchen like someone had yanked his control wire. His apron was still blotched with grease stains. His eyes scanned the cafe and locked onto Haley, like he had been waiting all morning for this moment. "How many times, Haley?" he barked, not caring at all that customers were watching. "I told you to double-check every plate before it leaves the line. This is basic stuff. You need customers to teach you now?" The cafe seemed to skip a beat. Tino looked up from the register. A new staffer holding a drink tray froze in place. A pair of college students at the back exchanged glances and shook their heads. No one said a word, because everyone knew this wasn't about eggs anymore. A line had just been crossed. Miles shot up from his seat. This time, he didn't stay quiet. His chair scraped sharply against the floor as it slid back. A few customers turned. Brent glanced over, frowning like he was ready to handle a customer stepping out of line. But before he could say a word, Miles reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Calm, unhurried, no theatrics. He opened it and took out a company ID card. The front showed the Dawnline Café logo, and on the back, in bold capital letters, Miles Thatcher, founder and CEO. He looked up. His voice wasn't loud, but it rang through the entire room. "I'm Miles Thatcher." He paused for just a second, long enough to let the air shift. "Founder of Dawnline Café, and this used to be what I called home." The espresso machine fell silent. No more clinking of silverware. Haley stood still, both hands still holding the plate of eggs. Brent froze. The two college students stopped breathing. The new girl with the tray stood in shock, completely unaware that it was now tilting to one side. Even the elderly customer stopped grumbling. He looked at Miles, then back at Haley, as if trying to process something no one expected on a regular Tuesday afternoon. Brent was the first to speak, his voice suddenly hoarse, visibly shaken. I didn't know." Miles cut him off. Not angry, just precise, and final enough to make a man choke on his own words. "Of course you didn't know. Because if you did, you wouldn't have dared speak to my people like that. You wouldn't have humiliated them in front of customers. And you definitely wouldn't have turned a team member who's been on her feet for 6 straight hours into your personal punching bag. He turned to Haley. She couldn't speak. Still stunned. Miles gave her a small nod. A quiet message. I saw it. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Then he turned back to Brent. We'll talk. Later. Brent swallowed hard. Miles stepped out from the dining area, walking straight behind the counter. Each step he took wasn't the stride of a boss demanding control. It was the measured walk of a man who had seen enough and wouldn't allow another drop of failure to spill into a cup that was already filled to the brim. The whole cafe felt like someone had hit the mute button. Spoons froze midair. A little kid who had been coloring turned his head toward the man who had just revealed he was the founder of the cafe. His wide eyes not understanding what was happening, but knowing something had definitely changed. Brent, who had been the loudest voice in the room, now stood frozen. His hand hovered awkwardly over his stained apron, lips moving but producing no sound. Just moments ago, he had been the predator, the dominant force in the kitchen. Now he was nothing but the hollow echo of false authority. Miles didn't need to yell. He simply nodded once, then said 4 quiet words. Let's take this inside. Brent understood immediately. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure, but his shifting gaze gave him away. One hand rubbed his forehead, like he was trying to convince himself things weren't as bad as they looked. But he knew. The eyes of the staff, the customers, the very server he'd just humiliated, were now witnesses to the moment he lost his title. Not through a formal HR memo, but through a truth that could no longer be ignored. Miles walked straight toward the office behind the bar, a small room with a thin wooden door marked Manager Only. Brent followed behind like a schoolboy being summoned to the principal's office. The door shut behind them with a dry, final click, the sound of an era ending. The office was plain, a basic desk, a loose office chair, a ceiling fan turning slowly under flickering, fluorescent lights. But on the desk, centered, was something Miles noticed immediately, a thick tan folder marked up with bright red ink and sticky neon notes. He didn't ask Brent. He opened the folder. Page after page, incident reports, notes citing employee errors, wrong orders, late arrivals, inappropriate tone with customer, incomplete end-of-shift cleaning. Every issue pinned on staff, not a single mention of a shift manager, not one acknowledgement that Brent had ever taken responsibility or offered a solution. It was a cascade of blame with no accountability at the top. Miles inhaled, closed the folder with deliberate firmness, looked up at Brent, not angry, just clear. You've created a culture of fear, Miles began. You humiliate people publicly, burn out the ones who care most, and turn what used to be a warm cafe into a cold, emotional assembly line. And I've now seen it for myself. Brent opened his mouth. I'm just trying to keep things running. We're understaffed. No one wants to work overtime. That girl Haley, I gave her a chance, but she can't keep up. You didn't give her anything, Miles cut in, his voice low but tight with restraint. She's worked 6 hours straight, no break, no water, no complaints. She still smiles at guests, still wipes up a child's spilled juice when no one else bothers. And while she's holding the entire floor together, you're standing in the kitchen counting her mistakes. Brent fell silent. Miles stood up, locked eyes, steady, unshaken. I let people like you take on leadership roles without verifying what really happens on the ground. That was my failure. But as of this moment, that failure ends. He reached into his wallet and took out an envelope, one he had prepared in advance, in case an on-site intervention was needed. Inside, an official termination letter, signed and authorized. Miles placed the envelope on the desk. You're terminated, effective immediately. Brent's eyes widened. You can't. I'm the founder of this company, Miles said, not raising his voice. And it's not that I can, it's that I must. Brent swallowed his words. There was no defense left. No shouldn't. No but. And now, no more power. Miles opened the door. Brent lingered for a moment, then reluctantly walked out. his steps no longer firm but wobbly, like he had just lost the only foundation he had ever leaned on. The whole cafe turned to look. No one clapped, no one cheered, but in their eyes was quiet consensus, like a storm had just passed, not with wind, but with the silent arrival of order. Brent walked to the exit. No goodbyes, no one reached out. He was no longer Manager Brent, just a name that once appeared on a shift schedule. Haley stood behind the counter, barely visible. Emery was still peeling an apple, but his grip had softened. The air no longer felt suffocating. Only the slow, rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan remained, like the sound of something finally starting to heal. 7:18 p.m. The last light of the day slid across the front windows of the cafe, casting a pale orange glow onto the tables. A light as cold and quiet as the atmosphere that had blanketed the space all afternoon. Dawnline Café, Riverview branch, had just closed for the day. No background music, no more order calls, no more Brent. And strangely, no one missed him. Miles sat at the farthest table, beside a chalkboard menu whose writing had long since faded. In front of him, a pitcher of ice water, 3 glasses, and 2 people seated across from him, Haley and Emery. Haley sat upright, but her hands were clasped tightly under the table, fingernails pressing into her palms. Her eyes were still red, but they no longer trembled. What remained was a cautious gaze, the kind formed by someone who has learned not to expect too much from anyone. Emery sat at an angle, one arm slung over the back of his chair, the other slowly spinning the cap of a pen between his fingers. It was the kind of fidget you'd expect from a college kid still carrying traces of shyness, but no longer avoiding eye contact. Miles spoke first. "Thank you for staying." It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't small talk. It was recognition, something neither of them had ever received from someone in power. He exhaled slowly, then looked directly at Haley. "I've been too far removed from reality," he said. "I read the weekly reports. I have quarterly meetings with regional directors. I thought I understood the situation, but today it became clear. I've let people like you carry the cost of my distance." Haley didn't respond right away. She just looked at Miles for a few seconds. Then her lips pressed together as if she were battling herself, between staying silent like always, or breaking the habit. Finally, she spoke. "I don't need rescuing. I don't need defending. I just want to feel like I'm not disposable." She paused, swallowed hard. "We're not machines, and we're not something you can just replace when it breaks." Miles didn't nod. He didn't interrupt. He let her continue. "Some days I work 9 hours, no breaks. No one asks if I'm okay. Brent marks down mistakes. Customers complain. Sometimes, all I want is for someone to actually see me." Emery now placed the pen cap down. He didn't look at Miles. He looked at Haley. "I stayed," he said, voice low but steady. "Not for the paycheck. Not because I love kitchen work. I stayed because if no one's got Haley's back, I can't sleep." That simple, blunt truth silenced the room for a beat. No poetry, no metaphor, just truth. So raw it ached. Miles turned to Emery, for the first time, seeing him not as a backline cook, but as a quiet protector of a system slowly rotting from within. "You worked anywhere else before this?" he asked. Emery shook his head. "Small pizza shop, then a school cafeteria. But this place, this is the first time I felt like I had a responsibility." "Why?" Emery met his eyes. "Because everyone here is working like they're trying to survive. But Haley, she works like, if she doesn't smile, the whole place will fall apart. And I can't let anyone push her to that edge forever." Miles didn't know how to respond right away. His throat tightened. He had always trusted in data, in dashboards, in quarterly strategy decks. But right now, sitting across from 2 people not mentioned on a single KPI, he realized these were the people keeping the system alive. "You don't need to hear how many times I'll say I'm sorry," Miles said softly. "The only thing that matters now is showing you it's going to change." Haley looked at him, no longer doubtful, not quite trusting, but at the very least, there was a small nod, a silent agreement. "Show me." Miles nodded back, this time more firmly. Tomorrow I'll be here, not as a guest, but as someone making things right. Haley looked up. You mean, I'm not leaving, not yet, not until I should. Emery smirked slightly, not a smile, but close. Well, this might be something the whole town will want to see. We're going to do better, Miles said, but not just better for this place, better for all of them. Outside, night had fully settled. The cafe lights glowed softly against the glass, casting faint reflections. The three of them, seated at a small corner table, felt like the starting lineup of a quiet revolution. And in that exact moment, Miles Thatcher believed one thing. From these ashes, a new culture could be born. The next morning, the sun rose earlier than usual. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was because something had changed at the Dawnline Café in Riverview. Miles arrived very early, before any of the staff. He unlocked the doors, turned on the lights, and personally wiped down the bar counter where fingerprints usually lingered each night. The leg of chair number 6, once wobbly, had been tightened and secured. He didn't do these things for show. He did them because he understood. If you want to change the culture from its roots, leadership has to be the first to get their hands on everything. At 7:05 a.m., Haley walked in, still wearing her faded uniform, still in the same worn work shoes. But when she saw Miles at the espresso machine, she stopped for a moment. "You're here early," she said, her voice mixed with surprise and caution. Miles didn't look up from the machine. "No meetings today. I'm staying here." Haley nodded and walked to the back, unsure of what lay ahead. But Emery was different. He arrived at 7:22, looking almost the same as the day before. Except this time, there was something different in his step. Lighter, more assured. As if overnight, Emery had gone from a young cook barely surviving to someone who now knew his voice mattered. Around 9 a.m., when the cafe began to fill up, Miles called the two of them over for a 10-minute sit-down mid-shift, something previously deemed impossible. "We're going to change a few things," Miles began, pulling 2 envelopes from his jacket. "Actually, no. I said that wrong. We're going to change everything." He handed the first envelope to Haley. "This is a special wage and bonus adjustment," he explained, "along with a spot in our internal management apprenticeship program, completely free, with a mentor from our headquarters." Haley opened the envelope, glanced at the paper inside. She froze. Her eyes blinked rapidly, as if trying to make sure she hadn't misread it. I didn't think," she stammered. "I'm just a regular person." Miles smiled. "It's regular people who do extraordinary things. When they choose not to abandon kindness, you didn't yell, you didn't complain, but you stayed. You held on to decency, even when the world kept knocking you down. And that deserves to be recognized." Haley looked down. Her hand gripped the paper tightly. For the first time in days, she smiled without forcing it. Miles turned to Emery. "And you, Emery, I know you weren't expecting anything from this place, which is exactly why you deserve more than anyone." He handed over the second envelope. New title, Operations Assistant. Not because you know every procedure, but because when no one else spoke up, you did. You stood up, not for yourself, but for someone else. Emery blinked, then gave a quiet chuckle, unsure of how to respond. "I've never managed anything." "You haven't," Miles agreed, "but you acted like a true leader, with moral instinct. The rest will train you." Haley gently tapped Emery's hand under the table. No words needed, just a gesture of acknowledgement from someone who knew him best. But Miles wasn't done. He opened his tablet and showed them a set of internal bulletins ready to go company-wide. "We're launching a new hiring campaign, the right way. No cheap flyers taped to windows, no vague help-wanted ads. We're hiring for the person, ensuring every shift is staffed, making sure every employee gets real breaks." He paused, looked both of them in the eye. "We can't save everyone overnight, but I want this place to be the example. That culture doesn't need slogans. It just needs action. From real people." Haley and Emery didn't respond right away. Not because they didn't believe him, but because they had never seen someone actually do this. Not on paper, not on a poster, but by showing up, looking them in the eye and saying, "I'm here, and I'm not leaving until this is made right. Haley was the first to speak. What if I mess up? What if I can't keep up? Miles cut in, gently but firmly. Then we won't leave you behind, just like you never left this place behind. Emery nodded, his strongest nod yet since any of them had met. And from a tired little cafe that had once become the lowest point of the service culture, a quiet revival had begun. No banners, no corporate PR, no speeches from a stage, just two young people. And a CEO who dared to come back, to do what everyone thought was already too late. 3 weeks had passed since the office door closed behind Brent in that shame-filled silence. And for the Riverview branch of Dawnline Café, those 3 weeks hadn't just been about new shift schedules, wage adjustments, or updated protocols. They were 3 weeks of rebuilding from the roots, not starting with the POS system, but with something much simpler: how people called each other's names. There were no more shouting voices from the kitchen, no more averted eyes when someone clocked in late, and most notably, no more staff sneaking bites of cold sandwiches in the stockroom out of fear they wouldn't have time to eat. Instead, there were quiet laughs during breaks. There were check-ins at the coffee machine. You okay today? There were gentle reminders to stay hydrated, simple acts of people caring for people. Haley now had time to tie her hair back neatly instead of stuffing it behind her ear. She no longer lowered her head when customers complained, because now most customers didn't. They smiled. They waited patiently. They came back, not just for the perfectly crisp waffles, but for something rare in modern service. They were remembered, and they remembered the names of the people who served them. Emery had changed too. He started waking up earlier, arriving ahead of schedule, not out of pressure, but because, for the first time, he felt like he belonged. As operations assistant, he began shifting how new staff were trained, not starting with rules but with a question. Where are you from? And Miles. He didn't just stay, he immersed himself. In the mornings, he sat at the end of the bar. No laptop, no phone, just a notebook, listening. In the afternoons, he stopped by the storage room to check in on people. He wasn't the boss anymore. He was simply present when people needed someone to be. Then on a chilly Friday morning in early spring, a middle-aged man stepped into the cafe. Wearing an old flannel shirt, he carried something wrapped in brown paper. He'd been a regular, the same man who had once witnessed Haley being shouted at. When Haley brought him his coffee, he handed her the package. For you, Haley blinked. I don't think I'm expecting anything. It's not a return, he smiled. It's a gift. She unwrapped it. Inside was a handcrafted notebook, soft brown leather, hand-stitched edges. On the first page, written in careful fountain pen ink, were the words, "Thank you for making this place feel like home." Haley couldn't speak for a few seconds. Her eyes stung, not from sudden emotion, but from something deeper. She had never imagined someone would remember her presence like that. Miles watched from behind the bar, and he knew, in that exact moment, the cafe had crossed an invisible threshold, from being a place that served food to being a place where people could heal. That evening, back at headquarters, he sent an email to the entire company. Subject line, introducing the Haley Grant message. Effective immediately, Dawnline Café is proud to launch the Haley Grant, an internal scholarship program for any employee across our system facing personal hardship, yet continuing to uphold compassion, work ethic, and commitment to community. This grant will cover vocational training, education support, and statewide mentorship opportunities. More importantly, this isn't for the best employees. It's for the ones who preserve the core values, even when no one was watching. He closed the message with one quiet sentence. Kindness doesn't need to shout to exist, but if it's never recognized, it dies in silence. By the next morning, responses from across the Southeast came pouring in. Managers from Greenville, Charleston, Savannah sent their gratitude along with lists of names, the ones who deserved to be seen. And Haley? She sat behind the counter, writing in the notebook she'd been gifted, not taking orders, but recording small stories from each day. Every line she wrote had no title, no timestamp, just fragments of goodness, stitched together like a memory corridor for a cafe that once forgot the very people who kept it alive. From that day forward, no one called it Dawnline number 7 anymore. They called it Haley's Café. Not because she owned it, but because now everyone knew her name. Saturday, 6:48 a.m. Sunlight poured through the large windows of Dawnline Café, Riverview branch. There was no longer a layer of dust dulling the glass. No more flickering fluorescent lights fighting to stay alive. The morning sun lit the wooden tables. Tables that, just 3 weeks ago, had absorbed silent tears, injustice, and words left unanswered. Miles Thatcher stood alone beside the old bar, exactly where he had sat on his first morning. The leather stool had been reupholstered. The countertop had been replaced, but the memories remained. Right here, he once heard that broken sob echo from behind the stainless steel kitchen door. Now there were no more tears, only the soft sound of a coffee cup being gently set down. Haley brought a cup of coffee to a customer. Her eyes shone with clarity. Gone was the forced smile he'd once seen. This one was real, unpracticed, undefended. Her hair was neatly tied back. Her uniform fit well. Her apron was clean. Her voice was calm and warm. "Would you like some extra sugar? If you're open to trying our new almond milk, I can bring you a sample." She wasn't trying. She was just being herself. The customer nodded, smiling. And Miles, he simply watched from a distance. He didn't need to step in anymore. Didn't need to fix anything. Everything was finally in place. Across the cafe, Emery was speaking with two new hires, one learning to run the espresso machine, the other reviewing how to make pancakes to company standard. Emery stood with his arms folded, calm and steady, half joking. "All right, anyone who messes up the batter ratio doesn't lose points, but they do have to wash every tray." The three of them laughed. A new customer walked up to the counter, hesitating slightly as he realized he was interrupting a training moment. Emery stepped forward, took the menu, smiled and said, "Don't worry. Around here, no one gets yelled at. We just look each other in the eye before we start." It wasn't in any training manual, but it had become the cafe's new philosophy. And to Miles, it was more valuable than any PowerPoint presentation he'd ever given a boardroom. He turned back toward the bar, where Haley was rinsing glassware. She caught his eye and smiled, a soft, quiet smile, like a wordless greeting. Not grand, not formal, but so sincere it could warm a person from the inside out on a still spring morning. Miles nodded, then placed the cafe's spare key on the corner of the bar. A simple gesture, but one that meant he trusted someone else could carry this place forward, without him needing to stand watch. He walked toward the exit. A light breeze stirred. The scent of fresh coffee drifted into it like a thread of memory. But this time, not a sad one. As his hand touched the door handle, part of him hesitated. Not because he wasn't ready, but because this place now meant something to him. No longer just an asset, but a witness. Miles paused, turned back one final time. Haley stood in the middle of the cafe, looking at him. Behind her, sunlight filtered through the window, forming a faint halo around her frame. She was no longer the girl apologizing with her head down for a dish sent back. She was the one keeping the fire alive for a culture being reborn. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "At last, it's a real cafe." Then he opened the door and stepped out. The familiar ding of the door chime rang out. But this time, it didn't mark the start of another hard shift. It marked the beginning of a new era. A cafe where people called each other by name, where thank you was heard more than hurry up, where a cup of coffee wasn't just a beverage, it was comfort. And on that day at Dawnline Café, the coffee tasted like hope.